You're listening to Crossword, where cultural clues lead to the truth of the word. And my name is Michele McAloon, your host, and we have a great book. This is another run to the bookstore type book. It's The Six Loves of James I by Gareth Russell. And it has been released today in the United States, December 2nd. It was released in the UK under the title Queen James. I encourage everyone to read this. This is absolute proof that history, if it is told well, it is a great story, and who needs fiction? So I really hope you enjoy listening to this. Gareth Russell was super fun to interview, and the book was just riveting. If you like my podcast, tell a friend. That's the best way to get my show around, and I really appreciate you listening. Keep reading, keep talking. God bless. Okay, folks, I have my run to the bookstore category, and we are so lucky. We've actually got 2 books in a row. My last week's book was on Edmund Fitzgerald, was really good. This one is fantastic, and it's The Six Loves of James I by Gareth Russell, and it is everything a historical narrative should be. Forget Game of Thrones. Forget any historical fiction. Just run to the bookstore, get this book, because it is history as it should be written. And we have the author, Gareth Russell, with us. Welcome to the show, Mr. Russell.
Thank you for having me, Michele. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you for that very lovely introduction.
Oh my goodness, it's sincere, let me tell you. Gareth Russell is currently sitting in London, but he's actually from Northern Ireland. He is a historian, and he has a whole history of books, of great books. His most recent book was Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, which actually sounds fantastic. But you also have a book on the Titanic. And then you were a main contributor to BBC Northern Ireland's in coverage for the death and funeral of Queen Elizabeth II and the accession of Charles III. And you've done The Palace from the Tudors to the Windsors, 500 Years of History at Hampton Court. So you really know the royalty.
Yeah, it's a strange old waltz to be involved with. Yeah, I do. I know that the history of royalty fascinates me. And certainly doing the coverage, particularly for BBC Northern Ireland, was of the late Queen's death and the current King's accession, was a fascinating moment because you were very conscious that you were in history as it actually happened in front of you. And those 10 days of national mourning when Elizabeth II passed away were absolutely extraordinary and an experience that I will cherish. And I was conscious too that, there's a sense of national pride and dignity when you're doing something like that. You want to make sure that you're doing it right. So I've been able to see history play out in my books and also in the present, and it feels very lucky.
Absolutely. I have to ask you a question because I don't remember the coverage of the funeral. And actually, I probably listened to it and didn't watch
Yeah.
it. Did King Charles attend his mother's funeral?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, great point, Michele, actually. So yes, so in the book that you mentioned, The Six Loves of James I, it will be mentioned that monarchs did not, by tradition, attend the funeral of their predecessors. That really started to change in the 18th century and solidify in the 19th, partly because of slightly different attitudes towards mourning and grief, and particularly in the Victorian period. The idea that the whole family attended was something that became really paramount throughout Western society, especially in Victorian Britain and in 19th century America as well. And so by the time you have Victoria, who's monarch from 1837 to 1901, and her son Edward VII, who's king from 1901 to 1910, the idea that they wouldn't attend had gone out the window. So we start to see a completely different protocol. And actually you start to see even changes in what we would call the color of grief. So the idea that monarchs didn't wear black, for instance, they didn't go into mourning for anyone, that was changed. And really the big motivating catalyst was Queen Victoria's intense public mourning for her husband, Prince Albert, when he died in the 1860s. So that's part of the change. So yes, Charles III went to his mother's funeral the way Elizabeth II went to her father's. But James I would not have gone to his predecessors' funerals because it wasn't done in the 17th century. It just wasn't the thing.
Very interesting. Let's talk about this man, James I. He is a fascinating character, and you do a really great job of describing the different forces that go into his life that make him the man. And you do such a brilliant job of looking at what is rumor, what is truth, what can be really read into his life. And I think that gives dignity to any historical figure's life of what exactly is the truth and what happened. This was a man that was born, as you said, born in fear. Give us a
Mm.
little background on who he was. And he really was born into drama. That trajectory was his whole life.
It's a very good way of putting it. It starts dramatically and it gets worse, or
Right.
better, depending on how much you love the drama, I suppose. So he is born in 1566 in Edinburgh Castle in Scotland. And he is the child of a very famous mother, probably the most famous woman in Scottish history. His mother is Mary, Queen of Scots, but he never really knows her. They last meet when he is 10 months old. And not long after that, she is the victim of a broadly Presbyterian uprising against her. It's partly motivated by her Catholicism, and it's also motivated by her remarriage, swift remarriage to a Protestant nobleman who was implicated in the mysterious death of James's father, who died when James was still in the cradle. And I always say Lord Darnley is a little bit like a royal murder on the Orient Express, in that he was so unpopular that everyone had a motive for his assassination. So by the time James turns 1 in 1567, he has lost his mother to politics and his father to the assassins. And at 13 months old, he's crowned King James VI of Scots. He's kept in a castle called Stirling, which is beautiful and secluded. And various male relatives run the government throughout his childhood. And he receives this extraordinary Renaissance education. He's fluent in multiple languages. He loves, we'd call them his manly sports. We'd call them gym class. He loves his physical exercise as well. He loves hunting, horse riding, playing soccer, and golf. But there's a lot of darkness and pain there. You know, his grandfather is assassinated in front of him. He never sees his parents. And he also has an abusive tutor called George Buchanan. And to your point about the dignity of truth and the historical figures, which I appreciate hugely, you also have to respect the dignity of your readers and allow them to make up their own minds based on the evidence that you lay out. And one thing that I'm sure a lot of historical readers are concerned about, Michelle, is when we maybe apply modern standards too much to the past.
Right.
Yeah, and that's an important distinction to make. So what you don't want to do is overcorrect and assume that anything horrible was just acceptable in the 1570s.
Right.
When I use terms like abusive, I mean it in context. They didn't believe in beating children. So George Buchanan was considered abusive in the context of that. So by our standards, definitely. He was a real Presbyterian ideologue, and he was dubious about monarchy, and he wanted to make sure James didn't grow up an absolutist or soft in Catholicism or to regret his mother's overthrow. And he tries to literally beat those ideas into James. And we have stories of his governess, Lady Mar, having to pull the tutor off James as he's beating him. There's a great love from his governess. There's, childhood companions, a luxurious childhood, but one overshadowed by the tutor. And so when James emerges at 17 to take over day-to-day running of Scotland, this is someone who has been forged in a very complex environment. He's also seen childhood friends betray him and support attempts to kidnap him. He is someone who has a deep, deep yearning to be loved, but a very, very fragile sense of trust. An extraordinary mind, a big heart, and even larger fear. And that really is the man who steps fully formed, if you like, onto this stage. And it's just before we came on, you and I were chatting briefly, and you used a word about James, I think, is so apt and it's pivotal because he is this pivot. And James's mother, his biological mother, as I say, is Mary, Queen of Scots. I sometimes like to think of James almost like a figure from Greek myth in that he has three mothers. He has his biological mother, Queen Mary, who he doesn't see after she's forced into exile and later beheaded. I think he regarded his mother, which was his governess, almost his stepmother. And he called her Lady Minnie, and that slang meant mummy. But his third mother was his godmother, was Queen Elizabeth of England. And they have a very long correspondence. And as Elizabeth's reign wears on, it becomes clear there will be no children. And he is front runner to succeed her. And when he's 36, that happens, and he becomes King of England, King of Ireland. He rules Wales. He becomes the first person ever to rule the entirety of the British Isles. And it is a period that essentially gives birth to the concept of Britain as a political state. He presides over enormous cultural, social, and constitutional changes. So this is a man, you say it starts in drama and it continues, and you're 100% right. He's nearly blown up on the gunpowder plot. There are witch hunts he presides over, witch hunts he disapproves of. Jamestown is named after him. There's the King James Bible. He patronizes Shakespeare. There's so much happening around him. And sometimes in history, when a lot is happening around the person himself is boring. And that's not the case with him. He's got
No.
fantastic... Yeah,
No, this is not, let me tell you, folks, this is not a boring figure of history that goes quietly in the night. Absolutely not. It's really interesting because he's really caught in the crosswinds of Catholicism and Protestantism. I would almost say a victim of this war that is a raging in this identity, because he's born to a Catholic mother.
Yep.
Mary, Queen of Scots, famously Catholic. And she apparently, a deal had to be made where she was not going to raise her child Catholic. She was going to have to raise him, or let him be raised Presbyterianism, which is the official religion of Scotland at that time. Of course, he's got the Anglican Church over in England from Queen Elizabeth, but he still has Catholic nobles and royalty in Scotland and in England. These are the winds of war throughout his life, isn't it?
Absolutely. And his various favorites, in many cases, some of the early people many falls in love with, or is really tied to, they are Catholic, or they're rumored to be soft in Catholicism. And one of the most prominent favorites that people never talk about in his time in Scotland is the Marquis of Huntly, who is said to be the second best looking man in the Scottish nobility, and we know that because he shot and killed the first best looking. He took out the rival. But Huntly is from a very old Catholic family, Clan Gordon, and they show no intention of bending the knee to Presbyterianism in the South. And James, I think, is a very sincere Protestant, but I don't think he ever really saw the need to enforce it in, say, the Highlands of Scotland. He understood that Catholicism's roots there were truly so deep that they were never going to turn. His wife, Anna of Denmark, at one point, there are widespread rumors that she is secretly converted. And he is sort of caught in the crosswinds of the Counter-Reformation. Where do we go from here? Because I think by the time he's born in the 1560s, it is even the most ardent supporter of the Counter-Reformation has accepted that Protestantism is a fact, and it's not going to be a sort of a heretical blip in the way some of the other ones, like, say, Lollardy had been. I think they've now accepted this as an embedded fact. But what Protestantism will be is unclear even to many Protestants. And the fact that it keeps on splitting, it keeps the pain of the Reformation alive in many ways. It leaves welt marks on the lives of many Protestants, because you mentioned Anglicanism, Michelle, and he's always, being accused of, by some, of he's never Protestant enough. Very few people can be Protestant enough for some of the Puritan sections, for instance. And James will be someone who is seen as useful to the Protestant cause, but there will always be people, both in Scotland and in England, pushing him to be more and to be more extreme. And that's something that happens to Elizabeth I as well. So yeah, I can see your argument absolutely. Here is someone who is a victim of a really fraught internecine religious period in our history.
Absolutely. You have a great observation in your book. And actually, you've got some great lines. You're really a true wit. And throughout the book, you really see your sense of humor. But you have a great line, and you talk about, and this is around the North Berwick witch trials, and why these witch trials were so virulent. And it actually has to do with religion and how that kind of breaks people's understanding. Explain that a little bit, because that's really interesting.
Thank you. That's actually the first time I've been asked about that, and so I appreciate it, because it was something I found
really
fascinating.
Good.
Thank you. It was fascinating. One of the things I find most interesting to write about, but if I'm honest, quite terrifying, is the moment when the certainty of society, or an established certainty, shatters. The buckling apart of a society is a frightening time, and there are many victims of it. So the Reformation, for good and for ill, shakes one of the great status quos in history, which is Christendom, which is Western Catholicism, is as close to a universal faith as it's possible to be. What the word Christian meant was an established fact. If you had asked someone in 1500, what is a Christian? They would have looked at you as if, like, what is the sky? Of course you know what it is. It's what's a tree. But if you ask someone in 1550, what is a Christian? The answer would have been incredibly difficult because all of a sudden the meaning has shifted. The Reformation has shaken it apart. And even Protestants can't agree what it is, what it means. And so when a world starts to fray at the seams, a lot of stuff starts to seep up that shouldn't be there. So when society's certainties are being shaken around, other things will crack with it. And one of the things I think many people were surprised about in the book is that we think of witch hunts as medieval, and they're not.
Right.
There are no mass witch hunts in the British Isles before the 1560s. They don't happen. There's occasionally accusations of witchcraft, usually against very wealthy women or politically inconvenient women. There's one witchcraft accusation in Ireland in the entirety of the Middle Ages. In Scotland, it's the same. It's actually men and women in Scotland, but they're always politically influential. What happens after the arrival of the Reformation are two very distinct things. The first is that Protestantism has a really increasingly hard line on what the supernatural is. So they reject the oral tradition. They reject the idea that God is still speaking through the words of man. They don't really have that tradition of the miraculous that Catholicism continues to embrace. And so if there are seemingly quote unquote unnatural phenomena, they will be attributed not to God, but to the devil. So the devil becomes more active in the discussions of the miraculous. And the other thing that is happening is that because everything seems to be shattering around them, you have Catholics trying desperately to protect what they see to be the spiritual integrity of a church under siege. And you have Protestants who are afraid of the might of the Catholic Church, but also distressed that their own church keeps fracturing. So if you are pursuing truth and the light as passionately as they are, it follows that the devil will be pushing the dark. So they see around them the demonic. They see a world under siege, a society under siege. Nothing is certain anymore. And that is why they start to look for the agents of this evil everywhere. And you see an explosion in the number of witch hunts. They all come from this period of Reformation and Counter-Reformation. So it's not, I think, what people necessarily think it is, which is vulnerable figures being pointed out in the Middle Ages. It's a much more targeted period of religious distress that causes it.
It's so interesting because as I read it, it's what we're seeing today in Western society. It's not too different. You can really draw a line between as our society kind of shatters and what we know is been permanent. And you really do. So I always say history doesn't repeat itself, but man's relationship to themselves, with greed and avarice and power and misunderstanding, that never changes. And how the events around it, it's left our creativity, but actually the core of history doesn't change. James, and we've got to talk about this, James I had a contentious understanding of womanhood. Talk to us a little bit about that, because that actually might have some influence on his adult life.
That was a very, very diplomatic way of putting it. Yes, he has a very contentious attitude to womanhood. So Buchanan essentially teaches a view of womanhood in which they are perfect, and that's rare, or they're monsters, or they're morons. I think that's very important in understanding some of the way that particularly hardline Protestants like Buchanan are teaching is the evisceration of Marianism within Christianity at this time does leave quite a serious imbalance in how womanhood is taught. The idea within Catholicism that the supreme example of humanity apart from Christ was a woman, that is gone. And so that there's a very different dialectic being taught. But very specifically, Buchanan wants to go after James's mother, Mary, a very different Mary, to undermine her and to justify the deposition of her by her own subjects. He presents her as a moral horror show. And he continues to do this. So James has, I think part of it is certainly linked as he gets older to his growing attraction to his own sex. And actually, we do see sometimes when ambassadors are commenting on him being kind of indifferent to women, that they probably was more romantically based than socially. But if you move from that into what does he think of womanhood in general, like many people with a particular prejudice, he's not overly logical about it. So when it is his wife or his daughter or his cousins or his governess, that doesn't apply. But he seems to think of women generally as a theoretical concept as silly. And he sort of says that they're fulfilled by nonsense and they're fulfilled by gossip and trivialities. And he has this idea that real business is done by men, yet he also does have really close relationships with his female relatives as he gets older. So I think he has, yes, a contentious and illogical attitude towards women. But what is interesting, again, to our point about presentism and abuse and how you describe it, it is noticeable enough to be commented upon in the 16th century, and that's saying something.
That really is saying something. His most enduring relationship was with his wife, Anna of Denmark, who he didn't marry for he married a lot later than he should have married as a royal, correct?
Yes. I mean, that again is probably linked to he is romantically involved with a man at that point, and that creates all kinds of trouble. Although, to give you an idea of just where Presbyterian priorities are, they seem much more horrified by the prospect that it's a Catholic rather than a man. They're so deeply concerned that this they're very concerned by that. It's one thing to lose a debate, it's another thing to lose a war. But really, yes, it is, as you absolutely say, Michelle, it's later. He does retreat to one of his palaces in the countryside where he prays for 2 weeks, asking for God to give him an answer. And in part, that is because he says himself he doesn't want to do it, but he also knows he has to. One of the oldest alliances in the world is monarchy and matrimony. They are hand in hand. He understands that family is the bedrock of early modern society, and it will prevent a civil war. But there are 2 princesses in the running, and he feels that prayer brings him to the Princess of Denmark. And she is one of my favorite figures in the whole book. I loved her. She's my kind of prickly and sharp. I
love that.
I don't like anyone too sweet to be wholesome. I like a little bit of a sharp kick. And when I'm writing about them, and she certainly could kick. She's the younger sister of Denmark and Norway. And to give your listeners an idea of this, so she looks like Princess Aurora when she turns up sort of willowy and blonde, and she plays up to that. And she's, oh, I'm so silly. And she pretends she can't learn Scots, the language everyone speaks at James's court. And that's a lie. She's completely fluent, but she pretends she can't speak it so she can hear what everyone's saying about her and then figure out who her real friends are. And she's 17 when she's doing this. She's a genius. But she is, they do their duty. They have children together. And I think she later figures out what way his tastes go. And she's very pragmatic about it. Her father had been a compulsive adulterer, and her mother had endured a great deal of humiliation with his illegitimate children sort of being paraded around the Danish court. And I think, well, do you know what? That's not going to happen this time with me. And also, she establishes very prominent friendships with Catholic families. She becomes a great patron of the arts. But to me, she is also his best ally. And they have a great sense of humor. And even when they're living apart, they write to each other quite often. They laugh at the same people, which I enjoy. But she, I think, really was the anchor of his regime. She's really clever, and she knows him and he knows her. And they've a vested interest in making this new hybrid British monarchy that they've kind of created work. He can't really handle crowds, Michelle. Today, some of his reaction to too large a crowd, we would probably say a panic attack or something. He does seem really overwhelmed. She is a bit like the late Queen Mother, who I, as you mentioned kindly, have also written about, or even Princess Diana, which is that she knows a crowd. She likes a crowd. She can smile and talk to people, and the English love her when she arrives with James in 1603. She's an influential powerhouse. I'll give you sort of one of my favorite anecdotes for your listeners, because it's unusual to laugh in an archive. It's usually frowned upon. But one of the letters they were writing was in the early 1600s, and she'd gone to visit some friends and he'd gone off hunting. And he wrote to her and he said, an aged earl who's in his late 70s had become betrothed to a 20-something beauty. And he said down, I write this to you basically, so when you hear it, you don't burst out laughing in public. And also don't say anything. It's a secret until the families announce the engagement. And she writes back, Your Majesty is right that I would laugh. Who would not? And as for keeping this secret, I shall happily, if you can tell me how to keep a secret I've already told to everyone I've met. And if I could put it to music, I would sing it. And there's this really like sharp, funny, quite modern sense of humor between them. So, Anna, you're absolutely right. The most enduring relationship was his wife. She was an exceptional queen consort. She really was an absolute force, and I loved writing about her.
Let's get down to brass tacks here.
Yeah.
Okay. So he has 7 children with her. And I mean, I think 7 children born alive, but she has numerous miscarriages, right?
Yeah.
And so they're doing things to make sure that they have babies, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Yes. So, but he's also, as you say, you can only say that rumored to have 15
Mhm.
lovers. You're going to only pin yourself factually on 3, where you have factual
Yes.
evidence, right?
Yes.
Pure factual evidence. Could this guy have just been Randy? I mean,
Possibly. Possibly. I think I also think one of the things that I decided to do really early on, I had included an appendix at the end because I think people are interested about the history of sexuality and how do we
oh, it's
approach
really
it.
good, actually. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, because I thought you would give that to people who want to read about terminology and things at the end. So thank you. I appreciate that. And also, I like to show my work. So, yeah,
Okay, it's
I
good.
say, listen, this is how I got here. Yeah, I would pin on 3, which is his wife, Queen Anna, Robert Carr, Earl of Somerset, and George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham. And that's because the letters between them, they're specific, they're colorful, let's say. I think one of the things I decided quite early on, Michelle, was I have to leave homosexual, bisexual, heterosexual, and asexual here, like at the back. I'll get here. And sometimes I think we approach it. Remember my religion classes at school, we had to teach about the ontological arguments for God. I bring a little bit of that with me where I think I can't do that. I can't start with he's gay, therefore he's bisexual, therefore he's. I just have to assume it's a completely blank canvas and I'll let the evidence take me wherever it needs to. And so I think it's possible he just had a really high sex drive. And actually, to the Randy point, the Stuarts are known as quite a passionate bunch. You know, his son, Charles the it certainly does have quite a high sex drive, but he is completely in love and faithful with his wife, who's also quite passionate. And then the grandson, Charles II, is, I think I describe him in the book as energetically heterosexual, which
Right.
was the most polite way I could describe Charles II and his carousel of lovers. So I think it's possible. The one thing I would say with him is that his infatuations or his loves are quite passionate and they're impactful politically. But I do think a high sex drive is certainly part of it. That's my own take on it, just from reading sort of the details and the letters, and also that there's an element with where both lust and love interact, or they both have this separately, I suppose, which is that it can be quite difficult for people to hide it when they're sort of in that full flush and rush of the early attractions, and he certainly couldn't do it, couldn't hide it at all. So it's possible. I think actually there's an element to which, you know, a bit of roundiness, I think, is actually, it's on the surface and you can't quite hide it. And I think that's not just his sex drive, but every major aspect of James's personality. He cannot hide it. If he's bored, he's theatrically bored. If he's passionate about anything, it's almost obsessive. So it's a person with very, very high everything, actually, to your point. So yes, I would think that's a fair assessment.
What's kind of amazing, though, reading through the book is history absorbed it. The people around him absorbed it. He wasn't drummed out. He wasn't cast aside. Now, he is a king, right? So it's hard to cast aside a king. But personally, he wasn't cast aside. It doesn't seem like he was, people knew it. It was an underground secret. He wasn't made fun of, at least not to his face, because he is the king. And I was kind of amazed of the flexibility that these people had to absorb this. And why is that? Why would you attribute that, besides him being a king?
Yeah, I mean, well, that is a big part of it. But I think part of it is that we have lost a little bit of my soapbox here, but I think we have lost a certain amount of respect for the complexities of our ancestors. I think we need to acknowledge the flexibility, what a great word, the flexibility and the sophistication of their minds. They were not the sort of homogenous block that we often see them as. They were really complex. There's some accounts that I found quite touching. I think we have to remind ourselves that in certain rural conservative communities at the time, the knowledge of what same-sex attraction was didn't exist. So there's quite a cute quote that I put in the book where I thought, oh, where a gentleman from one of these communities came to court to visit his cousin, and he writes about the king and says, oh, you know, him and the earl were hugging very seriously because he didn't quite know what he was seeing. So there's an element to which that explains it. And also in London, which is more vibrant, we'll say. In London, I think there was sort of a sense of they could laugh at him, but he wasn't ruining the country with any of these. And actually, when they looked around at some other countries and saw the price of civil unrest and the price of a society not functioning, the fact that James sort of never seriously weakened government or government policies in order to suit his private life, which other kings had done for mistresses or their personal life before. I think he did a really good job at yes, he was passionate and yes, he was obvious and he was very, very generous to them. But he did not allow the monarchy to take on water for them. He didn't change the ship of state. Even one of his last great favourite, the Duke of Buckingham, who he was beyond in love with, Buckingham pushed and pushed and pushed James to get Britain involved in the 30 Years' War in Europe, and James absolutely would not do it. So I think, to your point, part of it is the complexity of the fact that our ancestors, we need to remember that they were as clever as we are. Again, soapbox, but the idea that somehow we're cleverer than our ancestors, I just don't buy into at all. But also, it's a testament to the fact that he allows his personal life to be upended by these relationships, but he doesn't allow government policy to be. And if you're a Londoner or someone in the south, any part of England at the time, and you can see that things are ticking along okay, and your family are safe, and you're not getting involved in these wars, different priorities, I think, is the way I would square that circle.
Good lesson for governments. Yes, good lesson. He comes up with the most famous book in the world. I think it's still the most printed book in the world, and that's the King James Bible. How does he come upon this? Because this is, and I know this is kind of a separate history, but I mean, this is this man that has a kind of controversial personal life.
Yeah.
He comes up with this book, and it's changes the world, really.
Well, first of all, I'm so glad I'm talking about this with a canon lawyer, because I haven't been able to make these points in detail.
Good, okay.
So I'm so excited, Michelle. So I'll get to that final point about sort of, I think, the tradition of the church in a minute. But firstly, it is partly forced upon him. So when he comes south to England in 1603, there are massive tensions in the Church of England between the Puritan wing and the sort of the high Anglican wing that's a bit more sympathetic to Catholic traditions. And they have two competing translations of the Bible, and there's a massive petition from within the church for him to fix that, square that circle. He also loves languages, and he loves the study of them. He wants to encourage the best and brightest minds in England to come together and work on this. 7 years, the monarchy sinks a huge amount of money into doing this with this commission. So he cares about it. And sometimes, as you say, people say, how with this controversial private life could he do it? And saying, well, Henry VIII founded a church and he killed 2 of his wives, and that's a no-no as well. But the other thing I would say, just from a perspective of, I've been asked this a few times by evangelicals as well. And I mean, who cares what my own beliefs are? I think you have to leave those at the door and just give the reader a decent answer. So looking at it from the perspective of James and his time, I say start with the supposition that he has a very precise mind. He's a very legalistic view of things. So if you look at what he seems to think sodomy is, it's very precise, and it's not. I think he can rationalize that to himself as it being something distinct from what he's doing. But the bigger thing, I think, within the history of Christianity, and as I said this when I've been asked about it by people who are surprised by this, how I would phrase it is, if you look within the history of Christianity, there was a heresy really early on called the Donatist heresy.
Right.
The Donatists believed that, for those who haven't heard of them before, the Donatists believed that in order for a priest to administer the sacraments, they must be blameless. They must be like the lamb without stain or sin. And I think the church, probably in its wisdom, to be honest, anathematized that quite quickly and said that actually the vessel is irrelevant. You are the aqueduct. To me, within Christianity, James wouldn't have necessarily seen himself as needing to be perfect, because that anathematization of the Donatists, through Christianity, there's always been an understanding that there will be no such thing as the perfect vessel. There will always be a flawed vessel for the will of God. And I think that's how James saw himself.
Interesting. That's a great explanation for that. One other thing is he really was about peace. He did not want to go to war. And I loved your comment your historical accounting of, he said, well, I may spend a lot, but I'm not going to war. And that's a lot cheaper than going to war. That's basically what he says, right? But he really does. How long does he rule for? He rules for almost 50 years.
Yeah. And so he's I think with the exception, he's the longest reigning king of Scots. He's half a century in Scotland, and in England and Ireland, he's 22 years. It's two generations essentially grow up under him in Scotland and one in the rest of Britain. And peace is really important to him, Michelle. It's at the core. So he says that, he considers it the great honor of his life that he has avoided the unnecessary shedding of Christian blood. That's how he puts it. He grew up in Scotland where there was a lot of political feuds happening, and he'd seen a classmate killed in front of him when he was 11. And his argument was, none of us really remember what that was about, but we remember he's dead. He couldn't justify it. And he truly said that his feeling was if he could be remembered as Rex Pacificus, the peaceful king, the king of peace, he'd be happy with that. It took an immense amount of backbone to swim against public opinion like that, because the expectation was that kings went to war, and that was glorious. And he didn't believe that. He always hoped that one day, sort of mothers with their babes unborn would thank him for that. And that didn't happen. I don't think he ever really got the credit, because one of the big wars he didn't get us involved in, the 30 Years' War, no one knew until at least a generation after he died how astute that decision had been. Millions were killed in Europe because of this sectarian conflict. And he could not understand the veneration of war. He thought it was so wasteful. It was very rare that people's lives were left materially better off by it. So I think, had he been invaded, it would have been a different kettle of fish. But he could not understand why anyone thought they should be invading the Habsburg Empire. He just thought it was ridiculous, costly, painful, and pointless.
Again, ironic, because he was a big hunter. I mean, he was a man's man, sort of, out there, I guess, and he shunned war. Did you like him? Do you like this guy?
Oh, no. But I liked him a lot more when I finished the book than when I started. So I say no simply, but it's a very hesitant no. I was in awe of him at the end of it, and I did feel sad when I killed him off, if you like, at the end.
Right, yeah.
And I thought when he died in bed and on the throne in peace with his son holding his hand, I thought, oh, good for you, really well done. And I thought of all the hundreds of thousands of British lives he saved by not going into that war, and I did feel a huge amount of admiration for what he'd weathered. I think, on the other hand, though, he was prickly and bombastic and flawed. I suppose, I'm on the really slender side of no, just because I think he wasn't the cuddliest person. Did I walk away with a greater sense of what an extraordinary, brilliant, deeply flawed man this was? Then yes. Writing about him was one of the joys of my career. So I suppose when I hesitate on the no, it's because of all the joy that he gave me and that period gave me. What a thrill. Like, what a wonderful thing to be able to do for a living.
Oh, it absolutely is. You know what you do? You really shed on his humanity. And I have to be honest with you. When I saw the Queen James book, the title that it was released in UK, right?
Yes.
Okay. And then I saw Six of James. My first, when your publisher sent it to me, I thought, I'm not sure about this one. Folks, read the first 5 pages and you're hooked. I mean, so it was so good. It was one of those books I was sorry he died, I mean, so.
Great.
Okay. One last question. If you could ask him one question, what would you ask him?
When were you happiest? Because I think it would be a really unusual answer. And also, what I think with a good question, you leave it open enough that they'll tell you more. And I think if he could say, when were you happiest, maybe we'd hear about a period in his life that there isn't as much documentation for. Or maybe it would really surprise me. Like it was this one day in 1601 or something. I think when you ask them, when were you happiest, you will get a really surprising answer from them. And it would be a thrill to hear.
That's very interesting. Very interesting. Well, I know I'm never, ever supposed to do this. Never supposed to ask an author what their next project is, but you better have a next project in you. I can't wait.
Well, first of all, I just want to say a huge thank you for this interview, Michelle. I have absolutely loved it. And I'm so glad you bought the book. And it gives me a nice bit of pep in my step for the next one, because I'm sort of working on it at the moment. And it is called The Last Summer at Versailles. and it is about the summer that the revolution starts. So really the book covers from the start of 1789 through to the siege of Versailles in October of 1789. And it's told from the point of view of 6 people who were in the palace. So 3 women, 3 men, 2 on the right, 2 on the left, and 2 who just want to be left alone. And sort of what it looks like when society blows up around them.
Oh, I can't wait. I went to canon law school in France. So, you know what? I'm the first person you're going to interview. You're going to let interview when the book comes out.
Very
right?
happy. It has been bone chilling at times, seeing some similarities. I have loved working on this book. I still miss James a little bit, but this was Marie Antoinette and Lafayette and Desmoulins, Madame de Polignac were all excellent distractions. So I'm really enjoying it.
We can't wait. Well, Gareth Russell, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to talk with me. And you know what? Thank you for writing this book. You just keep writing. That's all I have to say.
Michelle, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And I am so glad you enjoyed the book. That's really kind of you.